Hi, are you interested in learning how to paint with gouache? Great. I'm Rebecca, I'm an artist, and I'm going to teach you things that I know. Today we're doing part 2 of how to paint this gouache skull. So let's go. So once you've got your permanent red down, again, this is part 2. So if you're a little lost, there is a part 1. I've mixed up a little pink, just white and permanent red, nice and saturated. I'm going to lay out the big areas of light color, and then I'm going to take a little bit of red and then nice and wet brush and go right up against that white to blend it out. With gouache, it's sort of straightforward to blend. It's water and pigment, and kind of controlling that with how much water you use or how much paint you use. I'm going to cover a lot of area in the larger part of the skull. I'm going to keep going over it with more pink and more red until I feel it's nice and blended out, until I have a smooth transition from light to mid-tone. The smaller parts of the skull are a little trickier. You can always use a smaller brush. I'm using the same brush that I started the painting with. And I'm using the reference photo to look back and double check my colors and my shades and my highlights. In between mixing up colors, I'm dipping into my water cup and making sure that I'm not mixing them on the palette, and I'm using my little puddles that I've created of mixed color. So I added a little more white because I want my highlights to be brighter. So before I did that, I wiped my brush off in the water and then on my towel, and then I went into the white. I'm using the same method that I did to go from pink to red, then I'm going from brighter white to pink. I'm like going with water up against those edges and blending out. I've got a little spritzy bottle, which I would recommend, but I think I got mine at the dollar store, but it just helps because your gouache is going to dry out. So it's nice to have that little spritz to waken the color back up, make it easier to blend and to put onto the paper or canvas. And I'm going around the skull, still in the larger parts, and then trying to cover areas from the top to the bottom with the same tone so that the painting looks cohesive. Sometimes if you get stuck in one area, it can look darker than the rest of it because you spent more time there, or lighter, vice versa. So I'm trying not to hyper focus, which goes against my nature, but now that I've got a good white and bright tone laid out, now I'm going to mix up some black, which I'm using just burnt sienna and Prussian blue. I'm going to mix up a nice little puddle, again using my water cup and my towel to wipe off my brush in between so that I'm not getting brown in the blue or blue in the brown, and I'm making a separate little puddle of color on my palette. If you have black in your gouache set and you want to use that, go for it. I think mixing up your own dark tones or black makes for a richer painting and a richer color. So now that I mix up that black, I separated a little bit out, and then I'm going to add red to that. So just the same way we mixed up a little bit of pink, I'm mixing up a little bit of maroon, and that'll be how I start my shadows and my darker tones. I'm going to generally work left to right. I'm right-handed, so I tend to smudge less if I move from left to right. And same method that we use to set out our straight mid-tones with the permanent red and the pink tones for the highlights. I'm going to start with the larger areas of shadow and then blend those out. So I laid down a little bit of this maroon dark hue, and then I'm using water and a little bit of red on my brush to clean up those edges, blend them out. If you're going for realism or a sort of stylized realism, which is generally what I go for, this is where you start to define your details and make it look more realistic. The more you blend out, the more that it's going to look like what you're trying to represent. Because in real life, things don't go from pink to dark red. There's sort of in-betweens. And I'm working from less detailed areas to more detailed areas bouncing around a little bit so that there's cohesion in my colors, especially since I mixed up my own black. If I have to mix the color again and start in a brand new area, it could be slightly different and it could take away from some of that cohesion to the painting. And it's already starting to feel more realistic, especially as we go into the eye sockets and the nose and adding the nice little shadows in there. And then I'm going to start with the base levels of my detail. So even though I'm going to go in with an even darker red tone later, this is nice to map out kind of the little hollows and crooks in a skull. And I'm bouncing back and forth from the water cup because water is how you control your pigment and how it blends. And if your brush is super wet, then it's going to spread out. But if it's just a little bit damp, then you have a little more control. It kind of just depends on what you're going for. If you have an area where maybe you want to add a little more red, but you don't want it to be super saturated, you can always go in with a wet brush first, no pigment, no paint, and then put a little bit of pigment on top. It'll tend to bleed, and so you've already mapped out your area. You know exactly where you want it to go, so you have more control, and it's not going to bleed into areas that you want to keep lighter or darker, etc. And now that I've got a nice range in my darks to lights, now I can come back with a sort of final layer of white. I might go in with a little bit more highlight, but this is like, okay, these are the brightest areas of the skull. Now that I've got a good range in tone and I know where my darkest dark is, then I can know where my lightest light will be. Because you control the palette, you control how dark something is or how light something is. That's why it's a painting of your creation. You get to decide. If you're working from a reference photo but you want it to be a little darker, that you can do that. You just have to make it darker. It's kind of magical, really. And so now that I've set out my palette, I've set out my range, I'm gonna make my brightest lights. And I'm blending out again, putting big areas of the brightest light, and then working out from there. So now it's time for the details. So I've changed brushes. I'm using a smaller, still watercolor round brush. And then I've used some of that black I mixed up earlier, put a little bit of red into a different puddle, but not as much as we did for the first area. I'm going into the darkest areas where the shadows in the sockets are, where the little cracks are, and then I'm gonna use a similar tactic, but since they're sharper shadows, I'm not gonna do as much blending, so I get like that, you can feel that hard edge. And I'm holding my brush kind of close to the bristles, so I have a little bit more control as I'm putting these details in. They're like really fine lines and little divots. It kind of just depends on how you work. I know some people tend to hold it a little bit farther down the brush and whatever feels comfortable, but for me, I find a little more control if I'm holding closer to the bristle. But not choking it, nothing insane. And then I'm going to keep going with this method, sort of moving left to right still, not going with smooth lines, but adding little divots for texture, not blending out very much so that it's not smooth the way the rest of the skull is, but it has a little bit of a hard edge, especially as I'm working in these little shadow parts in the nose and the eye sockets. And these are my final touches. I'm going in with the absolute darkest darks, not darts. And then moving around, checking back to the reference photo, making sure like I added a little bit more shadow to that jawbone because when I looked back, it seemed a little bit darker than where I had it. And again, you can make up your own shadows. You can make up your own highlights or how dark you want them to be. But I'm, again, using a little bit of stylized realism. And I'm saving the more detailed areas for last. Again, so I have cohesion, so I know how dark to make them. And I've already established the rest of the painting. So I'm going in with the teeth very last. And then just a few more adjustments and she's all set. And this has been the very last part of the gouache skull study. I'm adding my very last white highlights around little cracks and edges. But if I'm going to do some more lessons, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe. I'm very new, so any suggestions, absolutely leave them in the comments. But I've got an Instagram at revv_art. I'm on TikTok with the same name, no underscore. I've got a Patreon all linked below. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.